Benjamin Netanyahu. For more than 30 years, the guy's been like a fixed point in a world that's just pure chaos. To his followers, he's the protector. He's the only one willing to see the threats for what they really are. But to his enemies, he's the architect of an entire generation of conflict. So look, this isn't going to be a simple history lesson. This is an autopsy. We're going to use the tools of dark psychology, game theory, and geopolitics to really deconstruct the mind of the first living subject in this series, all to understand the engine that has driven the modern Middle East. And right away, this is the paradox that defines his entire story. This is the central tension of this whole explainer. On one side of the screen, you've got an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And on the other, this is the man credited with Operation Rising Lion, the 2026 mission that, according to intelligence projections, finally took apart Iran's nuclear program. So how? How does one man occupy both of these realities at the same time? Is he a savior who had to make impossible choices? Or is he a survivor who just lost his way? To find the answer, we have to go inside his mind. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to dissect his mind in 5 parts. First, we'll look at his foundational code. Then, his core worldview, the methods he uses to wield power. After that, we'll apply 2 really critical external lenses. And finally, we'll confront that ultimate question. Was he a savior or just a survivor? Okay, let's dive right in. To understand the man, you first have to understand the 3 key events that basically programmed his core identity. And this isn't just biography, this is his source code. To get Benjamin Netanyahu, you have to start with his father, Ben Zion. He wasn't just a parent. He was an ideological architect, a historian who spent his entire life studying one single brutal subject, the Spanish Inquisition. And from that deep, deep dive into persecution, Ben Zion walked away with this one unshakable conclusion you see on the screen. And you got to understand, this wasn't some academic theory. This was the atmosphere in the home. This was the conversation at the dinner table. It was literally the air that Benjamin breathed growing up. And so, this framework he inherited, it basically became his political DNA. It's this belief that Jewish history isn't a straight line of progress, but a repeating cycle of catastrophes. And in that cycle, the only thing you can change, the only variable, is Jewish strength. So in this model, compromise isn't diplomacy, it's just appeasement. Concessions aren't a path to peace, they are a form of national suicide. Strength is the only currency that history actually respects. He didn't learn this as a politician. He was raised inside of it. The second foundational event hits on, of all days, America's bicentennial, Operation Entebbe. An absolutely audacious hostage rescue mission 4,000 kilometers from home that became this global symbol of Israeli resolve. But for the Netanyahu family, it was a cataclysm, because the commander of the assault unit, the only Israeli soldier killed in that raid, was his older brother, Jonathan, Yoni. The psychological fallout from Yoni's death is just impossible to overstate. Yoni was the ideal. He was a philosopher warrior, brilliant, selfless, fearless. And in death, he was basically sanctified. He was transformed from a brother into a national martyr. So for Benjamin, this created this immense psychological burden. Survivor guilt became a political ideology. The living brother can never be as perfect, as pure as the dead hero. And so what does he do? He compensates with this intense, lifelong refusal to ever be seen as weak. And the third piece of that code was forged right here in America. He moved here as a teenager, got degrees from MIT and Harvard. But his real education was in the language of power. As a diplomat in Washington, and then later as the face of Israel on CNN during the Gulf War, he perfected the art of communication. He learned how to talk to the West, in its own accent, on its own terms, framing Israel's arguments in a way that American power could understand, and, more importantly, a way they would act on. So, how does this foundational code translate into action? Well, now we move from his programming to his operating system, these core beliefs that are running in the background of every single decision he makes. Netanyahu is a direct ideological heir to Zev Jabotinsky, who founded revisionist Zionism, and its central idea is something called the Iron Wall. The logic is simple, and it's brutal. Peace isn't going to come from goodwill or from making concessions. It's only going to come after the Arab world has thrown itself against an unbreakable iron wall of Jewish military power so many times that it finally gives up the hope of ever destroying Israel. Only then, from a position of absolute, undisputed strength, can real negotiations for peace even begin. And this part is absolutely crucial. For Netanyahu, the Holocaust isn't just some historical tragedy that we should memorialize. It is an active operational framework. He sees it as a case study in what happens when the world ignores a threat that has clearly stated its genocidal intentions. His takeaway is that Jewish leaders failed to act back then, and the world just stood by. Therefore, his sacred duty is to treat any modern existential threat, namely a nuclear Iran, with the same gravity as 1939. And to him, doing nothing is the ultimate betrayal. And this just highlights his consistent, almost obsessive focus on Iran for 3 decades. I mean, look at this. In 1996, he's telling the U.S. Congress that Iran is just a few years away from a bomb. In 2012, he holds up that infamous cartoon bomb at the UN, drawing a red line. For years, people dismissed him as a warmonger, a Cassandra. But in his mind and in the minds of his supporters, he was the only one willing to see the threat for what it was, a vigilance that ultimately led to the 2026 strikes. Okay, so we have his formation and his worldview, but how does he actually exercise power? This is where we get into his game theory toolkit, the specific, calculated strategies he uses on the world stage. His number one tool is Brinkmanship. It's the art of escalating a crisis right to the very brink of disaster. The goal isn't to go over the edge, but to make your opponent believe with absolute certainty that you are willing to. It forces them to be the one to back down and concede. The classic analogy makes it crystal clear. Imagine 2 cars driving head-on toward each other. The rational move for both is to swerve, right? But the winner of this game of chicken is the driver who can credibly signal that he has literally thrown his steering wheel out the window, that he is locked in. The other driver is now facing a choice between certain catastrophe and swerving. Well, Netanyahu has built his entire career on convincing the world that he threw away the steering wheel. And you see this everywhere. On Iran, he repeatedly convinced Washington that he was ready to launch a unilateral strike, which forced the U.S. to tighten sanctions and engage more forcefully. He showed it when he went to the U.S. Congress to publicly attack President Obama's Iran deal, a stunning break from diplomatic protocol. And in every single ceasefire negotiation, he pushes to the absolute edge of military escalation to get the most leverage, because he operates from the belief that power is the only thing his adversaries respect. Okay, this next tool is a bit more subtle, but it's pure game theory, the commitment device. Think of Odysseus tying himself to the mast so he couldn't be lured by the siren song. It's a strategy where you make your threats more believable by intentionally trapping yourself. It sounds like a paradox, but by deliberately removing your own freedom to choose, you signal to your opponent that you cannot back down, which forces them to be the one to change their strategy. And here's where we see how Netanyahu's own circumstances become strategic tools. By forming coalitions with far-right parties, he creates a political trap for himself. He can credibly go to the world and say, look, I can't make big concessions on settlements or a Palestinian state because my government would collapse. And his ongoing criminal charges for bribery create another trap. Staying in power is now a matter of personal freedom, not just politics. This turns any negotiation into an existential battle, signaling that he will do whatever it takes to survive. Okay, we've examined his internal wiring and his toolkit. Now let's step outside of his mind for a second and analyze his actions through 2 powerful external frameworks, one from ancient Greek philosophy and one from modern, post-colonial Africa. So Plato argued the human soul has 3 parts. There's reason, which seeks truth and guides long-term strategy. There's spirit, which seeks honor and legacy. And then there's appetite, which seeks personal survival, power, gratification. And for a leader to be just and effective, Plato said, reason has to be the charioteer, keeping the wild horses of spirit and appetite under control. The moment appetite grabs the reins, the entire state is put in danger. And this leads us to the central Platonic question about Netanyahu. For years, you could argue his actions were governed by reason, a brutal but coherent long-term strategy for Israel's survival. But critics say that as his legal troubles got worse, something shifted. So the question isn't if a shift occurred, but when. At what exact moment did the appetite for personal and political survival hijack the strategy of the state, dressing up decisions made for his own benefit as decisions made for the nation's? Now, the second lens comes from South Africa. Their legal team brought a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, and the power of their argument came not just from the law, but from their own identity. They claimed that as a state that had lived through the systematized oppression of apartheid, they recognized the familiar architecture of control in Israel's actions. Their main piece of evidence was Netanyahu's own speech invoking the biblical nation of Amalek, which they presented as clear evidence of intent. It was a really profound critique coming from a nation claiming to see its own painful history reflected in the conflict. Which brings us to our final analysis. We've looked at his programming, his worldview, his methods, and the external critiques. So now we bring it all together to look at the 2 starkly different, yet somehow equally plausible, portraits of this one man. And this is the unfiltered standard. On one side, you have the perfect picture. Netanyahu as this historic, almost Churchillian figure, a strategic genius who correctly saw the existential threat from a nuclear Iran when nobody else would listen, and then had the guts to neutralize it. A political master who outlasted every single opponent at home and abroad to protect a vibrant, if flawed, democracy in the world's most dangerous neighborhood. But then, there's the worst picture. A cynical politician totally consumed by his own survival. A leader facing serious charges of bribery and fraud, accused by the families of hostages of abandoning their loved ones for political gain, and whose military policies led directly to an ICC arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So ultimately, after this autopsy of a mind, we're left with the one question that will define his legacy. Was Benjamin Netanyahu a man who did what no one else was willing to do to ensure the survival of his people? Or was he, in the end, simply a man who could no longer tell the difference between saving his country and saving himself?